Another good question here. Chronic flexion pain, continue to avoid flexion or begin retraining it? So before we answer that question, most importantly, before we propose any solutions, if you are flexion intolerant, why are you flexion intolerant? Because if you can't answer that question, then you've got no right to then jump into assuming an answer or picking a tool from a toolbox to start beginning solving that problem, because you don't know the problem you're trying to solve. So I'll give you an example. So when we talk about flexion intolerance, we've got to be very careful. For example, generally people are flexion intolerant is because they've kind of overused that mechanic to the detriment of not using their core and their hips properly. That's a big sweeping statement, generalization. That's not for everybody, but say 75% of the cases of people that are flexion intolerant. But there'll be different reasons why that's happening. You have to pick the right tool. So somebody could be flexion intolerant that when they slip into flexion, a rounded position, it irritates an active disc bulge or herniation that gives them sciatica. So when they lean forward, they get a pain down the left or the right leg or something goes numb. But when they come out of flexion, go back into extension, it starts to help it heal and settle down. Or you could have someone that hasn't got active disc bulge or herniation, or maybe used to have, but now what's happened is that they've done a good job protecting that joint and it's kind of healed, but now they're starting to wear out the joint or the two joints above it, and then they have an instability issue in there that they need to address. So they need to shore up stability first, because when they slip into flexion, they get a little catch as they go in, and as they come out of flexion, they get a little catch as they come out. So again, if you're flexion intolerant, you really need to understand why you're flexion intolerant before we propose a solution, because those two different situations there are going to have slightly different approaches to them. So for example, someone who has active disc bulge causing sciatica, yes, we're going to avoid flexion, but their first port of call is to heal that disc bulge, that herniation. So for them, we might test them to see in a prone extension position to use that disc recovery to help that disc injury heal. However, for someone who's got delaminated discs and has unstable joints, putting them into disc recovery position is probably not going to do too much for them. What they need to do is really focus on building stability around that area and really learning to move from their hips a lot better, a lot sooner. So everything starts to kind of shear up and they shove that workload that's breaking down those vertebrae, those discs, down into the hips, into a big ball and socket joint that can bear that load as quickly as you can. So again, it depends. Generally speaking, as a general approach, I'm never going to say never, but I've never really had to give people flexion. If they come in flexion intolerant, it's because they've done too much of it and they overuse that mechanic. So me giving them more of it isn't really going to solve the problem, especially when we understand what happens to the passive tissues in the lumbar spine when we give people flexion, how the discs don't adapt, well they adapt by delaminating, become weaker and more unstable. And then we also think of the ligaments around the spine as well. If we do lots of flexion work and they start to stretch, they kind of stretch like plastic. They're never going to really go back the same way once you start to stretch them. So if that's something you need to do for a specific reason, for example, maybe you do gymnastics or your Olympic diver needs to get into a fully pike position, something like that, that might be something worthwhile for you to do. But for the vast majority of people that I see, they have flexion intolerance because they overuse it and they're woeful at using their hips. So my answer to them is to get you to learn to use your hips better, so we're not putting so much workload through that lumbar spine. And before you know it, the pain's settled, the back feels better, and they're starting to heal because they're putting the workload into a more appropriate structure rather than the lumbar vertebra. So again, never say never. I generally don't retrain flexion in people because I don't need to. What I need to do is retrain them how to use their hips properly. And that's what helps the back start to recover, and then we get more equal distribution of workload across those tissues and structures in the lumbar spine and the hips. So again, before you jump to any conclusions or pick any solutions out or any particular tools or exercises, why are you flexion intolerant? You must answer that question first of all before you propose a solution or latch onto a plan of action. Question from Noah. I am working with a McGill PT now for several months and I'm progressing slowly but surely. But I think I'll have to manage flexion for a very long time. I know that your injury history, you have said that you have had to manage flexion. Do you ever still get flare-ups, or was there a time after your initial injuries where you would get good days and bad days? So, for those who don't know, just over 10 years ago, I had 2 disc bulges and a herniation. Went for the circus through a couple of different chiros and an osteo, and they actually ended up making me worse, not better. That's how I kind of got, involved in the McGill approach and actually trying to find out what my actual problem was and making sure I was using the right things to solve that problem. But anyway, so talking now, I still get good days and bad days, but not in the way you would think. So now I'm at like my normal day to day is 0 pain, but also on top of that, I actually feel like I move well and I can do things like jiu-jitsu, play with my 4-year-old son, do all those things fantastically well. A bad day for me is where I go to jiu-jitsu and I just feel a bit slow, a bit gluey, or at worst, the back just feels a little bit tight. And that's it. Like, I don't get flare-ups where I can't walk and I'm in bits. I just know now that when things are normal, things are working well, I know if things drift a little bit. So again, a big key thing to understand with dealing with a back pain injury long-term and to be successful is the idea of managing a bank account. So basically the bank account represents how much work your back will tolerate before you start to get problems. So on a good day and the bank account is full, you move well, feel well, you're not going to feel the back. If you get a bad day or a series of bad days and that bank account starts to get lower, you'll start to feel things change. So when you first start out, you're going to feel like your old back pain's starting to come back. You're going to feel like a twinge or a catch or something feels not right. It's kind of going back to square one almost. As you get further and further along the rehab process and you build a bigger and bigger bank account and you learn better and better movement habits, your sort of tell will happen before it gets to that stage. So for example, for me, like if I know before my back's going to get really bad, my left hip function starts to change a little bit because of the way that I move and tend to do stuff. I tend to buckle this lateral split in my left side, which causes my left hip to be like the glute feels a bit gluey and a bit kind of like not the same as the right hip, and it feels a bit weird. That's my tell before it escalates into my back. So if I feel that come on, that's a good, literal kick up the bum for me to get back on top of things and stop it escalating into my back. So do I get good days versus bad days? Yes, but it's probably not, a bad day for me would be someone's ideal good day. Oh, my left hip feels a bit funny. So it's all relative, but that's what you're kind of looking for, and that idea of the bank account then applies for the rest of your life. So there's a saying I got from Dr. Andrew Locke that back pain is not for life, but exercise is, and that's what we mean is that you have to do the work to keep your weaknesses strong to stop your back having to be sort of take over and too much work and get chewed up again. So you have to put that effort in to keep things, once you've solved a problem, put the work and effort in, the maintenance work and effort in to keep it solved long term, and that way your actual original back pain will never come back ever again, so long as you do that. If you get complacent with it, then it probably will at some point. How do we know if our physio has given us a thorough assessment? I've been bad for 2 years, I cheekily put. I think you may have answered your own question there. So yeah, if you're working with a physio for 2 years and it's still bad, you haven't had a thorough assessment because you're not actually, you haven't clearly identified the problem enough to actually be able to work on solving it. So simple comes down to, if I've had have I had a thorough enough assessment? Can you answer these 2 questions? What causes your pain? Why is it there? So for example, if you have sciatica and then you test and you find out what's causing that sciatica. So is it discogenic or is it stenotic in nature, for example? So it's discogenic, is it a disc bulge or a herniation? If it is, why do you have the disc bulge and the herniation? Because knowing what's there will help you heal it. Knowing why it's there will help you stop it coming back in the future. So you'll know what those faulty movement patterns are, or exercise or things you may be doing that have created that damage to the disc, for example. So again, answer those 2 questions. What causes your pain? Why is it there? Once we get those 2 questions answered, then we can begin working on that. How do we fix it and how do we keep it fixed for the long term? But that, if someone gives you an assessment, they need to be able to answer those 2 things for you. What causes your pain? Why it's there? If they can't, they're probably not going to be very successful at helping you solve the problem and or keeping it solved for the long term. Why does lower back pain often have an onset 1 to 2 days after the aggravating activity? So usually this happens for a lot of people, and it's usually more, not necessarily always, but more often not, it's to do with how they train and exercise. So for example, if deadlifts are a bit suspicious, They might not necessarily feel the back have a big flare up on the actual day of the event, but over the next couple of days as things are fatigued, they'll start to notice their back feels suspicious. So basically what it comes down to is you've got unmanaged aggravators. And when I talk about aggravators, I talk about two different categories. There's the active ones, so that's how you're potentially lifting, moving and doing stuff that's movement based. And then they're the passive ones, so sleeping posture, standing posture, sitting posture, generally your mind's elsewhere. What do you sort of try and tend to do that facilitates muscular imbalances or puts you back at more risk of being injured? And again, it's the idea of the bank account. So probably what you're finding happening is that you're probably training or doing something or having an event that's draining your bank account. And then because you've got uncontrolled aggravators going on elsewhere, that's then draining the bank account even more until it gets to a problem. The other thing we need to consider, you'll have to excuse the siren. There it goes. Is what we call AMI, or arthrogenic muscular inhibition. So that's when we have pain or irritation around a joint, how that then affects the muscular recruitment of the muscles around, near and around that joint. So for example, if you do certain things with your hip, that can aggravate or impede your ability to control your glutes, and therefore your ability of your glutes to actually stabilize your hip joint, your hip socket. So again, with backs is a series of joints. So the way I look at it is that if you've got aggravators going on irritating the joints in your back, it's going to make your body respond in certain ways and overuse certain muscles to try and solve that problem. And that again ingrains muscular imbalances. So what you might find is that you've got a load of uncontrolled aggravators in day to day, and then you have a sudden exposure to a particular exercise, and that restarts that cascade off, so that you start to drain that bank account over the next couple of days as your movement habits become corrupted in response to that exercise, and that's where you get a flare up. So then you naturally rest a few days, and you start to go back the other way, and everything kind of goes back to normal. Your back feels okay again. So again, when you have that sort of very predictable pattern, the good news is it's definitely responding to how you're choosing to use your back. So therefore, if you choose to use it in a better way or better ways and change your movement habits, then you won't get that kind of cyclic up and down, like good days versus bad days with a very predictable pattern. So again, it's a big clue when we have that sort of stuff. It's annoying, but at least you know it's responding to something that you can control. So therefore, you control it better, you won't get that reaction.